The encounter begins. The evening sun hung low over the sprawling Denver International Airport, casting a golden hue across the bustling terminals. The rhythmic hum of announcements echoed through the hallways, mingling with the murmur of hurried travelers. Among them was Martin Langston, a prominent investment banker whose entire persona radiated the success he had meticulously crafted. Martin strode through the terminal, his tailored charcoal suit pristine, his leather shoes clicking confidently against the polished floor. A man of calculation and precision, Martin lived by the principle that appearances dictated worth. He held his first-class ticket tightly, a testament to his status and achievements. As he approached Gate 32, Martin glanced at the boarding queue forming for the flight to New York. His gaze flitted over the passengers, scanning for signs of wealth or importance. It was a habit born out of years in the corporate world, where a person's attire and demeanor often spoke louder than their words. Among the crowd, Martin's attention snagged on a man who stood out, not because of grandeur, but for the lack thereof. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple gray sweatshirt, well-worn jeans, and sneakers. His luggage was a modest duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The man exuded an air of calm confidence, a stark contrast to the frantic energy around him. Probably some blue-collar worker trying to blend in, Martin muttered to himself, his lips curling into a faint smirk. First class must be running a promotion. As the announcement for first-class boarding echoed through the terminal, Martin stepped forward with practiced ease, his every movement deliberate. He handed his ticket to the gate agent, receiving a polite nod in return. Walking down the jet bridge, he felt the familiar rush of superiority that came with claiming his rightful place among the elite. Settling into his window seat, Martin adjusted his cufflinks and scanned the cabin, noting the impeccably dressed passengers around him. He leaned back into the plush leather seat, savoring the luxury that set him apart from the masses. His moment of tranquility was disrupted when the casually dressed man from the terminal stopped at the row beside him. The man glanced at his ticket and then at the seat number. Martin stiffened, his mind racing. Surely there must be a mistake. But the man calmly stowed his bag in the overhead compartment and took the aisle seat next to Martin without hesitation. For a moment, neither spoke. Martin's discomfort was palpable. The presence of this man, so at odds with the polished ambience of first class, felt like an intrusion. He opened his tablet, feigning focus on his emails, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The man beside him seemed unbothered. He adjusted his seatbelt and pulled out a book, a thick, well-worn volume with an unassuming cover. The corners of the pages were dog-eared, the spine creased from use. Martin squinted at the title but couldn't make it out. "You don't see that every day," Martin muttered under his breath, the words just loud enough to invite a reaction. The man glanced at him briefly, offering a polite nod before returning to his book. His indifference irked Martin. Used to commanding attention and respect, Martin wasn't accustomed to being dismissed. The flight attendants began their pre-departure service, offering drinks to the first-class passengers. When they reached Martin's row, the attendant turned to the man beside him first. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said warmly. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Martin froze. "Mr. Carter." The familiarity in her tone was unexpected. The man politely declined, thanking her with a smile that seemed effortless and genuine. Martin felt his chest tighten. Who was this man? The gears in Martin's mind began to turn. He glanced at the book resting on the man's tray table. Embossed on the cover was the name E. Carter. It didn't ring a bell, but something about the way the flight attendant addressed him made Martin uneasy. As the plane taxied to the runway, Martin's irritation grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his seatmate than met the eye. The man read with quiet focus, occasionally jotting notes in the margins of his book, while Martin's tablet remained on, more a prop than a tool at this point. In an attempt to assert his dominance, Martin cleared his throat and turned slightly toward the man. "Looks like you lucked out with this seat," he said, his tone laced with condescension. The man looked up, his expression neutral. "Excuse me," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "I mean, first class isn't usually this casual," Martin said, gesturing vaguely toward the man's attire. "But hey, everyone deserves a little luxury now and then." The man raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. "That's one way to look at it," he said simply, before returning to his book. Martin clenched his jaw. The man's response was disarming, his composure unshaken. Determined to regain control of the interaction, Martin pressed on. "So, Mr. Carter, what do you do?" The man closed his book slowly and met Martin's gaze. "Management," he said. Martin's smile tightened. "Management? That's broad. Small business, I assume." "Something like that," Carter replied, his tone polite but noncommittal. Martin chuckled, though it lacked genuine humor. "Well, good for you. It's nice to see someone trying to make it big." The words hung in the air, dripping with implication. But Carter didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. The flight attendant returned, interrupting the tense exchange. She handed Carter a handwritten note on airline stationery. "Compliments of the captain," she said with a smile. Carter thanked her graciously, folding the note and tucking it into his pocket without a second glance. Martin's curiosity was piqued, but before he could ask any more questions, the attendant turned to him with a perfunctory smile. "Would you like anything else, sir?" "No, I'm fine," Martin replied curtly, waving her off. As the plane ascended into the evening sky, Martin stared out the window, his mind racing. Who was this man, really? And why did his presence feel so unsettling? The answers, he would soon learn, were far more surprising than he could have imagined. Tensions built. The plane hummed steadily as it climbed to cruising altitude, the cabin bathed in a soft glow of overhead lights. Martin adjusted his seat, feigning comfort, but his mind was anything but at ease. His neighbor, Mr. Carter, sat unbothered, flipping through his book with the kind of focus Martin envied. Martin couldn't shake his unease. The calm aura surrounding Carter was unnerving, almost as if the man was quietly aware of something Martin wasn't. The flight attendant's familiarity with him, the note from the captain, none of it added up. Who was this casually dressed man, and what did he do to command such deference? Trying to mask his growing frustration, Martin turned back to his tablet. Emails from executives and urgent financial updates filled the screen. Normally, they would occupy his attention entirely, but today they felt trivial. Every so often, his eyes darted to Carter's book, the name E. Carter embossed on the cover like a silent challenge. "I have to figure this out," Martin thought, his pride refusing to let the mystery go. He decided to dig further. "So, Mr. Carter," Martin began again, his voice laced with forced cheer, "that book you're reading. It seems intense. What's it about?" Carter looked up, his expression polite but guarded. "It's about systems optimization," he replied, closing the book slightly to show Martin the cover. "A bit technical, but it's useful for my work." "Systems optimization," Martin repeated, his brow furrowing. "Sounds niche." "It's applicable in a lot of areas," Carter said, his tone calm. "Especially when managing large-scale operations." "Large-scale operations?" Martin echoed, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "You must have quite the setup." Carter offered a faint smile, neither confirming nor denying the statement. "I suppose you could say that." Martin leaned back, his mind racing. Large-scale operations. Was Carter some sort of logistics manager? Perhaps he owned a mid-sized company. Yet, his demeanor suggested something far greater, something Martin couldn't quite put his finger on. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dinner service. The flight attendants moved methodically through the aisle, serving plates of salmon and steak to the first-class passengers. When they reached their row, Martin couldn't help but notice how they addressed Carter with an extra layer of attentiveness. "Mr. Carter, would you like the salmon or the steak?" the flight attendant asked with a warm smile. "The steak, please," Carter replied, his tone friendly. "And for you, sir?" she asked Martin, her voice polite but noticeably less enthusiastic. "Steak," Martin muttered, waving her off. His chest tightened as the imbalance in their treatment became more apparent. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to sting. Martin was used to being the center of attention, the one who commanded respect in any room he entered. Yet here, he felt like an afterthought. As they ate, Martin's mind remained restless. He picked at his steak, his appetite dulled by his frustration. Across from him, Carter ate with unhurried ease, as if completely unaware or unconcerned by Martin's internal struggle. Unable to hold back any longer, Martin spoke again. "You know what," he said, keeping his tone light. "You've got everyone's attention on this flight. Must be nice to get that kind of treatment." Carter looked up, his fork pausing midair. "What do you mean?" Martin gestured vaguely toward the flight attendants. "The way they're treating you, like you own the airline or something." Carter chuckled softly, setting his fork down. "I wouldn't say that. They're just being professional." "Professional?" Martin scoffed. "Come on, I've flown first class plenty of times, and I've never seen anything like it. They practically bow when they talk to you." Carter's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. "It's not about how they treat me," he said, his voice calm. "It's about how you're choosing to see it." Martin blinked, caught off guard by the comment. "What's that supposed to mean?" Carter leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady. "You've been watching me since we boarded, making assumptions about who I am and why I'm here. Maybe the issue isn't with how others are treating me, but with how you've chosen to interpret it." The words hit Martin like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Carter's tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried a weight that made Martin squirm in his seat. "Listen," Carter continued, his voice softening. "I don't blame you. We all make assumptions. It's human nature. But those assumptions say more about you than they do about me." Martin's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment bubbling to the surface. He wanted to push back, to reclaim the upper hand, but Carter's calm demeanor made it impossible. Instead, he turned back to his tablet, feigning interest in his emails once again. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Martin remained glued to his screen, though his thoughts were far from the data before him. Carter returned to his book, his composure unshaken. The tension between them hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. As the plane began its descent into New York, Martin felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the flight was almost over, and dread at the realization that he might never get the answers he sought. Who was Carter, really? And why did his presence bother Martin so much? The final blow came as the plane touched down, and passengers began gathering their belongings. A man in a sharp uniform, a representative from the airline, appeared at the front of the cabin. He scanned the rows briefly before his eyes landed on Carter. "Mr. Carter," he said with a smile, stepping closer. "The car is ready for you on the tarmac. Welcome back, sir." Carter nodded graciously, standing to retrieve his bag from the overhead compartment. Martin watched, stunned, as Carter exchanged a few words with the airline staff before turning back toward him. "Have a good evening, Mr. Langston," Carter said, his voice calm and even. He gave a small nod before stepping into the aisle and making his way toward the exit. Martin sat frozen, his mind racing. How had Carter known his name? And what had he meant by "welcome back"? As he replayed their interactions, the pieces began to fall into place. Carter wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just a businessman. He was someone far more significant, and Martin's assumptions had blinded him to the truth. The weight of the lesson settled over Martin like a heavy cloud. He had judged Carter based on appearances, only to realize too late that he had completely miscalculated, and as he gathered his belongings and stepped off the plane, Martin couldn't help but feel that he had been the one exposed, not Carter. Revelations and regrets. The terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport was alive with movement. the clatter of rolling suitcases and the murmur of conversations blending into a symphony of travel. Martin Langston stepped off the jet bridge, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tiled floor. His grip on his carry-on was tighter than usual, his mind still reeling from the strange, humbling encounter on the flight. He glanced down the long corridor, catching a fleeting glimpse of Carter walking briskly toward a private entrance, flanked by the airline representative. A sleek black car awaited him on the tarmac, its glossy surface reflecting the dim airport lights. The driver, dressed impeccably, opened the door with a respectful nod. Carter slipped inside without a second glance. Martin stopped in his tracks, the scene unfolding like something out of a movie. He felt a pang of envy. And something else. Was it regret? Shame? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the man he had dismissed as an outsider had just been whisked away with the kind of deference Martin had always craved. Shaking his head, Martin continued toward the baggage claim. He told himself it didn't matter. Carter was gone, and they were unlikely to ever cross paths again. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. As he waited for his luggage, Martin's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from his assistant, Amanda. Amanda, your meeting with the Ridgeway Group has been pushed to 4 p.m. tomorrow. Let me know if you'd like me to schedule a call with Mr. Carter in the meantime. Martin froze, his breath catching in his throat. Mr. Carter. He stared at the message, his heart pounding. Could it be the same Carter from the flight? The coincidence seemed too uncanny. He quickly typed a reply. Martin, which Carter are you referring to? Amanda. Elliot Carter, CEO of Carter Industries. He's expressed interest in collaborating on the Ridgeway deal. You two might want to align before tomorrow's meeting. Martin's stomach dropped. Elliot Carter. The name finally clicked. Carter Industries wasn't just a company. It was a global powerhouse in logistics, technology, and systems management. Elliot Carter wasn't a middle-tier manager or even a successful entrepreneur. He was a titan in the business world, a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe. Martin's mind raced back to the flight, to every dismissive comment he'd made, every assumption he'd formed. He had treated one of the most influential figures in his industry like an intruder, a man unworthy of first-class luxury. And now he was supposed to collaborate with him. He let out a shaky breath, his pride and ego crumbling under the weight of his realization. This wasn't just about an awkward interaction. It was about the implications for his career. Carter Industries' potential partnership with the Ridgeway Group was a game-changer, and Martin knew his company's success hinged on it. If Elliot Carter decided he wasn't worth working with, it could unravel everything Martin had worked for. Grabbing his suitcase, Martin headed toward the exit, his mind spinning with strategies to salvage the situation. He couldn't afford to let his earlier behavior dictate Carter's impression of him. The hotel encounter. Martin arrived at the sleek Midtown Manhattan hotel, where his company had booked him a suite. The city's skyline glittered through the towering glass windows as he checked in, the receptionist handing him his key card with a warm smile. Welcome, Mr. Langston. If there's anything you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to let us know. He mumbled his thanks, his thoughts elsewhere. As he rode the elevator to his floor, he rehearsed how he might address Carter during their inevitable conversation. Should he apologize outright? Try to explain his behavior on the flight. The prospect of facing Carter again filled him with equal parts dread and determination. Martin's room was spacious and elegantly furnished, but he barely noticed as he tossed his luggage onto the bed. He had just settled into the armchair by the window when his phone buzzed again. Amanda. Update. Mr. Carter is staying at the same hotel. I've left a message with his assistant to arrange a meeting for tomorrow morning. Martin stared at the message, his pulse quickening. It was as if fate was orchestrating his humiliation. He couldn't decide if the coincidence was a blessing or a curse. At least he wouldn't have to wait long to address the elephant in the room. The unexpected invitation. That evening, Martin received an unexpected call from the hotel concierge. Mr. Langston, this is the front desk. Mr. Elliot Carter has requested your presence for dinner in the private dining room at 8 p.m. Shall I confirm your attendance? Martin's heart skipped a beat. Carter had invited him. The thought sent a jolt of anxiety through him, but he knew declining wasn't an option. This was his chance to make amends, or at least attempt to. Yes, Martin replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Please confirm. The concierge thanked him and ended the call, leaving Martin alone with his thoughts. He glanced at his watch. It was already 7:15 p.m. Taking a deep breath, he headed to the bathroom to freshen up, choosing his finest suit in the hope that it might help restore some of his shaken confidence. Dinner with Carter. The private dining room was an intimate space with dim lighting and an air of exclusivity. Martin arrived promptly at 8 p.m., his nerves tightly wound. He was greeted by a staff member who escorted him to a table where Carter sat, a glass of red wine in hand. Carter looked up as Martin approached, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. He gestured to the seat across from him. Mr. Langston, he said, his tone measured. Thank you for joining me. Martin swallowed hard and sat down. Mr. Carter, I appreciate the invitation. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension was palpable, but Carter seemed entirely at ease. Finally, he broke the silence. I thought it would be good for us to have a conversation before tomorrow's meeting, Carter said. After all, first impressions can be complicated. Martin felt his face flush. Carter's words weren't accusatory, but they carried an unmistakable weight. He took a sip of water to steady himself before speaking. Mr. Carter, I want to start by apologizing for how I acted on the flight, Martin said, his voice sincere. I made assumptions I shouldn't have, and I spoke out of turn. It was unprofessional and unfair. Carter studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. I appreciate your honesty, he said, but I'm not interested in apologies. What matters to me is how people handle their mistakes and what they learn from them. Martin nodded, his relief tempered by the gravity of Carter's words. I understand, he said. I've spent a lot of time today reflecting on what happened. It's made me realize I need to approach people and situations with more humility. Carter's gaze softened slightly. Humility is a good start, he said, but it's only part of the equation. What you do next is what truly defines you. The conversation shifted to business, and Martin found himself surprised by Carter's approachability. Despite his immense success, Carter spoke with clarity and focus, offering insights that were both profound and practical. By the end of the meal, Martin felt a flicker of hope that their working relationship might survive his earlier blunders. As they parted ways, Carter left Martin with a parting thought that lingered long after he returned to his room. Remember, Mr. Langston, Carter said, his voice calm but firm, respect isn't about titles or appearances. It's about how you treat people, whether they're wearing a suit or a sweatshirt. Martin nodded, the weight of the lesson settling over him. He had a long way to go, but tonight had been a start, a chance to rebuild not just his professional reputation, but also his character. The power of perception. The morning sun filtered through the skyscrapers of Manhattan, casting long shadows over the bustling streets below. Inside the sleek boardroom on the 20th floor of a midtown skyscraper, Martin Langston sat at the head of a long, polished table, meticulously reviewing his notes. His company's future hinged on the outcome of today's meeting, and he couldn't afford to misstep. Across from him sat his colleagues, their faces a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. They had all heard about Elliot Carter's influence, though few had ever met the man in person. Martin's assistant, Amanda, had spent the morning peppering him with reminders and updates, her usual brisk demeanor tinged with nervous energy. Remember, she had said, this isn't just a pitch meeting. Carter is known for being as intuitive as he is analytical. He'll see through anything insincere. Martin nodded, though her words only added to the weight already pressing on his shoulders. Last night's dinner with Carter had been a humbling experience, a sharp reminder of the gap between perception and reality. Now, as he waited for Carter to arrive, he couldn't help but wonder how their interaction would play out in a professional setting. The door to the boardroom opened, and all heads turned as Elliot Carter entered. Dressed in a tailored suit that exuded quiet confidence, he moved with the same calm authority Martin had witnessed on the flight. His demeanor was unhurried, his gaze steady as he surveyed the room. "Good morning," Carter said, his voice carrying just enough weight to command attention without needing to raise it. The team greeted him in unison, their voices slightly uneven. Carter took his seat at the far end of the table, setting a sleek leather portfolio in front of him. He exchanged a brief nod with Martin, who forced a smile and began the introductions. "Mr. Carter, thank you for joining us today," Martin said, trying to keep his tone steady. "We've prepared a detailed presentation on how our company can align with Carter Industries' strategic goals, particularly in the context of the Ridgeway deal." Carter nodded, his expression neutral. "I'm looking forward to hearing it." As the presentation began, Martin couldn't help but notice how intently Carter listened. His gaze moved between the slides and the speakers, his face betraying no emotion. It was unnerving, yet it demanded respect. This was a man who didn't waste time on pleasantries or distractions. He was here to assess value, plain and simple. Martin led the discussion, his voice steady despite the nerves simmering beneath the surface. He highlighted key figures, projections, and opportunities, weaving a narrative that emphasized innovation and growth. His team chimed in with supporting data, their rehearsed pitches polished but not overly slick. Carter occasionally asked questions, each one cutting to the heart of the matter. How does this proposal account for long-term scalability? What contingencies are in place for market volatility? His inquiries were sharp but fair, forcing the team to think critically and respond with precision. By the time the presentation concluded, Martin felt a flicker of hope. The team had performed well, and Carter seemed engaged, though his stoic demeanor made it difficult to gauge his thoughts. Carter leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled as he regarded the group. "It's a solid proposal," he said finally, his tone measured. "But I'm not just looking for numbers. I'm looking for partners who understand what it means to build something meaningful. Can you tell me what that means to you?" The question caught Martin off guard. He exchanged a quick glance with his team, who looked equally uncertain. This wasn't a question they had prepared for, and Martin knew the response had to come from him. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Building something meaningful means creating value that goes beyond the bottom line," he said slowly. "It's about forging partnerships based on trust, delivering solutions that have a real impact, and challenging ourselves to think differently. It's not just about growth, it's about purpose." Carter studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Purpose is a good start," he said, "but purpose without action is just words. I'll be watching closely to see how you translate that into reality." The tension in the room eased slightly, though Martin knew the real challenge was just beginning. Carter's approval wasn't something to be earned in a single meeting. It was a process, one that required consistency and integrity. A lesson in leadership. After the meeting, Martin lingered in the boardroom as his team filed out. He needed a moment to collect himself, to process the whirlwind of emotions that had carried him through the past 24 hours. Just as he was about to leave, the door opened, and Carter stepped inside. "Mr. Langston," Carter said, his tone calm but purposeful. "A moment." Martin nodded, his pulse quickening. "Of course." Carter closed the door behind him, the faint hum of the bustling office fading into silence. He crossed the room and leaned against the edge of the table, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. "I wanted to say something off the record," Carter began. "I've been where you are, eager to prove myself, quick to judge, certain that success was all about how others saw me. But let me tell you something. Real leadership isn't about appearances. It's about substance." Martin swallowed hard, the weight of Carter's words sinking in. "I realize that now," he admitted. I spent too much time focusing on the wrong things. Carter nodded. It's a lesson we all have to learn, some sooner than others. The important thing is what you do with it. You've got potential, Langston. Don't waste it chasing superficial victories. The conversation was brief, but it left a profound impact on Martin. As Carter left the room, Martin felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He had been given a second chance, not just professionally, but personally. The turning point. Over the next few weeks, Martin threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. He took Carter's words to heart, reevaluating his approach to leadership and collaboration. He sought out feedback from his team, listened more than he spoke, and focused on building relationships based on mutual respect. Carter Industries ultimately approved the partnership, a victory that solidified Martin's standing in the business world. But for Martin, the true triumph wasn't the deal itself. It was the transformation it had sparked within him. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, Martin opened an email from Carter. It was brief, but its message carried weight. Elliot Carter, congratulations on the Ridgeway deal. Remember, leadership isn't a destination, it's a journey. Keep walking the path. Martin leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally on the right track. New horizons. The weeks following the Ridgeway deal marked a seismic shift in Martin Langston's life. Not just professionally, where his newfound partnership with Carter Industries propelled his company into an elite tier, but also personally, where he found himself reevaluating what truly mattered. The sharp lessons he had learned from Elliot Carter lingered, shaping his actions in ways he hadn't anticipated. Martin sat in his spacious corner office, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's skyline. The desk before him, once cluttered with status symbols and ostentatious decor, was now clean and purposeful. Gone were the trophies and plaques meant to impress visitors. In their place was a simple leather notebook and a framed photograph of his late father, a man who had always valued hard work over appearances. As he leaned back in his chair, Martin's thoughts wandered to Carter. The man was an enigma, his influence subtle yet profound. Martin had been deeply humbled by their interactions, but what stayed with him most was Carter's ability to lead with quiet confidence. It was a stark contrast to the brash, assertive style Martin had once believed necessary for success. The ripple effect. It wasn't long before Martin's shift in mindset began to ripple outward. His team noticed the difference almost immediately. Where Martin had once dominated meetings with his commanding presence, he now approached discussions with an open mind and a willingness to listen. In one such meeting, his marketing director, Sophia, presented an unorthodox idea for a campaign. The old Martin would have dismissed it outright, favoring tried and true methods. But now, he leaned forward, genuinely curious. "Tell me more about how this approach aligns with our goals," he said, his tone inviting rather than skeptical. Sophia hesitated for a moment, unused to his interest. Then, encouraged, she launched into a detailed explanation, her passion shining through. By the end of the meeting, not only had Martin approved the idea, but he had also empowered Sophia to lead the project, a decision that would later result in one of the company's most successful campaigns to date. Word of Martin's transformation spread quickly. Employees who had once feared his scrutiny now sought his guidance. His ability to foster trust and collaboration attracted top talent, further solidifying his company's reputation. Even his peers in the industry began to take notice, reaching out for advice and mentorship. But not everyone was ready to embrace the change. There were those who viewed Martin's new approach as a sign of weakness, mistaking his humility for a lack of ambition. One such individual was Robert Klein, the CEO of a competing firm who had long considered Martin both a rival and an adversary, a challenge from the past. One afternoon, Martin received an unexpected call from Robert. "Langston," Robert began, his voice sharp and businesslike. "I hear you're working with Carter Industries now. Impressive. But I'm curious. How long do you think this new nice guy act will last?" Martin frowned but kept his tone neutral. "It's not an act, Robert. I've realized there's more to leadership than just hitting numbers." Robert chuckled, a hint of derision in his voice. "That's all well and good, but let me give you a piece of advice. The business world isn't kind to idealists. People respect power, not vulnerability." "Power and vulnerability aren't mutually exclusive," Martin replied, his voice steady. "True power comes from understanding others, not just controlling them." There was a pause on the line, and Martin could almost hear Robert's smirk. "We'll see how far that philosophy gets you. Good luck, Langston." The call ended, leaving Martin thoughtful. He knew Robert represented a mindset he had once shared, one that prioritized dominance and self-interest over collaboration and growth. It was a reminder of how far he had come, and how far he still had to go. An unexpected reunion. One evening, as Martin prepared to leave the office, he received a message from Amanda. "Amanda, Elliot Carter is in town. He's invited you to a private event tomorrow evening. Details attached." Martin's heart skipped a beat. Though their partnership had grown stronger over the past few months, he hadn't seen Carter in person since the deal closed. The invitation felt like an opportunity and a test. The event was being held at an exclusive gallery in Soho, known for showcasing thought-provoking contemporary art. Martin arrived dressed sharply but not ostentatiously, a deliberate nod to the lessons he had learned. The room buzzed with conversation, the crowd a mix of business leaders, artists, and philanthropists. It didn't take long to spot Carter. He stood near a large abstract painting, engaged in conversation with a small group. His presence, as always, was commanding yet approachable. When he saw Martin, he excused himself and approached with a warm smile. "Langston," Carter said, extending a hand. "Good to see you." Martin shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for the invitation. This is an incredible event." Carter gestured to the art around them. "It's a fundraiser for an education initiative I've been supporting. Art has a way of sparking dialogue, and dialogue leads to progress." As they talked, Martin couldn't help but notice how seamlessly Carter navigated the room. He treated everyone, from the gallery staff to the high-profile guests, with the same level of respect and genuine interest. It was a stark contrast to the transactional relationships Martin had once cultivated. Their conversation eventually turned to the Ridgeway deal and its success. Carter listened intently as Martin shared updates, nodding in approval. "You've done well," Carter said. "But remember, success isn't just about results. It's about the legacy you leave behind." Martin hesitated, then spoke candidly. "You've taught me a lot, Mr. Carter, more than I can express. But I still wonder, how did you learn these lessons yourself?" Carter's expression softened. "Life has a way of humbling us if we let it. I wasn't always this way, Langston. I made my share of mistakes, burned bridges I shouldn't have. It wasn't until I lost something irreplaceable that I realized the cost of living without purpose." The weight of Carter's words hung in the air. Martin didn't press for details, sensing the story behind them was deeply personal. Instead, he nodded, grateful for the insight. As the evening wound down, Carter placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. "Keep growing," he said. "You're on the right path. Just remember, leadership is a journey, not a destination." A new chapter. The next day, Martin returned to his office with renewed clarity. He began outlining a mentorship program within his company, aimed at fostering the kind of growth and development he had experienced. He reached out to colleagues and competitors alike, extending offers of collaboration rather than competition. The transformation wasn't always easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and lingering resistance from those who preferred the old ways. But Martin pressed on, guided by the lessons Carter had imparted. In time, Martin's company became known not just for its success, but for its values, a legacy built on integrity, empathy, and a commitment to making a difference. And though the journey was far from over, Martin knew he was finally walking the path he was meant to. A legacy forged in change. The seasons shifted, and the once vibrant autumn hues of New York faded into the silvery stillness of winter. For Martin Langston, the past year had been transformative. What began as a humbling lesson in humility and respect had blossomed into a new way of life, one rooted in purpose and authenticity. His company had grown in ways he could never have anticipated. Profits were up, yes, but more importantly, employee satisfaction, client loyalty, and public perception had all soared. Martin had learned that success was no longer a solitary pursuit. It was a collective journey, the catalyst of change. On a brisk January morning, Martin found himself preparing for a keynote speech at a global leadership summit in Geneva. It was an invitation he never thought he'd receive, a chance to speak to the world's most influential minds about the evolution of leadership. As he stood backstage, the faint murmur of the crowd reached his ears. Leaders, innovators, and changemakers from every industry had gathered, their anticipation palpable. Martin glanced at his notes, but instead of the polished speech he had prepared, his mind kept returning to one phrase. Leadership is a journey, not a destination. The phrase had become a guiding mantra, a reminder of everything Elliott Carter had taught him. Martin smiled to himself, tucking the notes into his pocket. He knew what he needed to say, and it wasn't on the page. When his name was announced, Martin stepped onto the stage, the spotlight warm against his face. He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the audience. They were expecting strategies, data, and formulas for success. What he would offer instead was a story. The keynote. "Good morning," Martin began, his voice steady yet heartfelt. "When I was first invited to speak at this summit, I asked myself a simple question. What can I offer a room full of leaders who have already achieved so much? The answer, I realized, was not about what I could teach, but about what I've learned." The room was silent, attentive. Martin took a deep breath and began to share the story of the flight that had changed his life. He described his initial assumptions about Elliott Carter, the quiet lessons he learned through their interactions, and the profound impact those moments had on his perspective. "I had spent years chasing the illusion of success," Martin said, his voice resonating with emotion. "I believed that power was about control, that leadership was about dominance, and that value could be measured in numbers. But one encounter shattered those illusions and taught me that real power lies in connection, and true leadership is about service." He spoke of the transformation that followed, not just within his company, but within himself. He shared how fostering empathy and respect had created a ripple effect, touching every corner of his organization and beyond. Leadership, he concluded, isn't about reaching the top of a ladder. It's about building a ladder strong enough to hold others, even if you never see the top yourself. The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that echoed long after Martin stepped off the stage. It wasn't the applause that mattered to him, though. It was the conversations that followed. Attendees approached him with stories of their own struggles, their own moments of reckoning, and their own desires to lead with greater purpose. A reunion. Later that evening, at a private reception, Martin found himself once again face to face with Elliott Carter. The older man was sipping a glass of wine, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the buzz of activity around them. "Mr. Langston," Carter greeted, his lips curling into a faint smile. "I heard your speech. Impressive." Martin chuckled, shaking his head. "If it was impressive, it's only because of what you taught me." Carter waved the compliment away. "I may have given you a nudge, but the journey was yours to take." They talked for a while, their conversation flowing easily. Carter shared his thoughts on the challenges of leadership in an ever-changing world, while Martin reflected on the importance of mentorship and community. "You know," Carter said, his tone growing thoughtful, "when I look back on my own journey, I see a lot of missteps, a lot of lessons learned the hard way. But the most rewarding part has always been seeing others take those lessons and build something greater. You've done that, Martin, and that's a legacy worth having." Martin felt a surge of gratitude, the kind that went beyond words. "If I'd done anything right," he said, It's because I've had people like you to guide me. Carter raised his glass in a small toast. To the journey. To the journey, Martin echoed, clinking his glass. The ripple effect. Months turned into years, and Martin's influence continued to grow. His company became a model for ethical and impactful leadership, attracting partnerships with organizations that shared similar values. He established a foundation dedicated to mentorship and education, inspired by Carter's own philanthropic work. Elliot Carter remained a steadfast presence in Martin's life, their relationship evolving from mentor and mentee to equals and friends. Together, they worked on initiatives that aimed to reshape how leadership was understood and practiced across industries. Martin also became a sought-after speaker, not because of his business acumen, but because of his authenticity. He didn't speak about profits or market shares. He spoke about people, about the lives touched by decisions made in boardrooms, and the importance of leading with integrity. A final reflection. One quiet evening, years after that fateful flight, Martin sat in his study, a leather-bound journal open before him. On the first page, he had written a single phrase: "Leadership is a journey, not a destination." He smiled as he read the words, thinking of all the people who had shaped his path, his team, his family, and of course, Elliot Carter. The lessons they had taught him were etched not just in his mind, but in the lives he had touched along the way. Martin leaned back, gazing out the window at the glittering city below. For the first time in his life, he felt no need to chase success. He had found something far more fulfilling: the knowledge that he had made a difference, not by standing above others, but by standing beside them. The journey, he realized, was far from over, but he was ready to keep walking, one step at a time.